Abandoned at birth, a 76-year-old black woman carried a lifetime of silent pain. When doctors discover her serious heart condition, an entire historic black community mobilizes for her. An old document reveals her right to ancestral lands and triggers a battle against powerful forces. The outcome of this story will move you to tears, a journey of unwavering faith that spanned generations. Subscribe, leave your like, and comment which city you're following this story of resistance from. In the town of Oakwood, deep in rural Georgia, the wind carries untold stories. Among the dirt lanes and modest homes walks a figure who has become part of the local landscape. A 76-year-old black woman, whose name few know but whose presence everyone recognizes. Her stooped body, shaped by the weight of years and sorrows, moves with the wisdom of someone who learned to survive in silence. Her hands, rough as the bark of the century-old oaks lining the town's river, tell stories her voice rarely dares to utter. In her gaze, deep as wells in a time of drought, dwells a disconcerting mix of sadness and hope, of open wounds and poorly healed scars. The rising sun always finds her awake, as if sleep were a luxury she never learned to fully enjoy. She wakes before the roosters crow, obeying an internal clock programmed from her earliest years, when she still believed serving was her only purpose in the world. Even now, decades after gaining a freedom she never imagined possible, her eyes open before dawn, preparing for a daily battle against oblivion and invisibility. This woman's story begins with an abandonment that would mark her existence. On a rainy May night, a fragile cry echoed on the steps of St. Sebastian's Church. The priest, an elderly man with a generous heart, found a small bundle trembling in the fine drizzle. A newborn baby girl, her skin as dark as a moonless night, had been left to the mercy of charity. There was no note, no name, only a red thread tied around her tiny wrist, the sole link to a past she would never know. The priest, unable to care for the child himself, entrusted her to a family considered respectable in the community. The Harrisons, landowners who commanded forced respect, agreed to take the girl in. What no one suspected was that behind the white walls of their large house, a perverse system of exploitation disguised as charity was growing. At 5 years old, when other children played and discovered the world, the girl was already carrying buckets of water and scrubbing floors until her knees bled. Her name, given by her benefactors, was Mary, a common name, just as her existence was meant to be common in the eyes of those who exploited her. "Be grateful we took you in when nobody wanted you," Mrs. Harrison would repeat, watching little Mary work tirelessly. "God puts everyone in their place, and yours is to serve with humility." These words, planted like poisonous seeds in the child's mind, blossomed into a deep belief that her life had no purpose other than servitude. For years, Mary believed her destiny was written in the stars she rarely had time to contemplate. Yet, in the cracks of her oppressed existence, something survived. A spark of faith that not even daily humiliations could extinguish. At night, after everyone else had fallen asleep, Mary would whisper prayers learned during the few times she was allowed to attend church services. She didn't understand all the words, but she felt they somehow connected her to something greater than her suffering. In her heart, she held the inexplicable certainty that one day her tears would be wiped away by divine hands. The seasons passed, and the girl became a woman under the yoke of exploitation. Her dreams, small as mustard seeds, were cultivated, in secret. While washing clothes, she imagined herself free. While cooking for the family that never considered her part of it, she nourished herself with silent hopes. Her body grew, but her possibilities remained chained to the Harrison house, where every dawn brought the same limited horizon. At 29, an unexpected event opened a crack in the wall surrounding her life. The youngest Harrison son, drunk, on the power he believed he held over the one he considered a servant, tried to assault her one night when his parents were away. Mary, moved by a strength she didn't know she possessed, defended herself with surprising firmness. The young man, humiliated by the resistance of someone he deemed submissive, threatened to report her to the authorities for assault. It was at this moment that Mary realized she had to flee, not just from the immediate violence, but from an entire life built on the denial of her humanity. Under the cover of night, carrying only a bundle of worn clothes and the invisible scars of a life of abuse, Mary left the Harrison house. Her bare feet knew every stone on the path leading to the river, where she had so often washed clothes that would never be hers. It was on the banks of this same river that she found temporary refuge in the Liberty Creek community, a historic black settlement that resisted time and oblivion, preserving ancestral traditions like precious seeds saved for better times. The first days of freedom were marked by the constant fear of being found and punished. Every noise in the night, every shadow cast by the moon among the trees, transformed into the menacing figure of the Harrisons coming to get her. Slowly, however, the community's embrace made room for a new feeling to germinate in her heart: the possibility of belonging. There, among people who carried in their bodies and souls the marks of a history similar to hers, Mary began to understand that her pain was not unique, but part of a collective wound that, when shared, became less unbearable. It was in this new space that Mary discovered the transformative power of chosen work. Using the only trade she knew, she began washing clothes to support herself. But now each clean garment represented not her subjugation, but her autonomy. The river waters, which had once witnessed her silent tears, now reflected the face of a woman who, despite the circumstances, chose to believe that better days would come. Her hands, marked by hard work, became symbols of a quiet resistance against a system that had tried to convince her of her insignificance. The years passed, transforming the young Mary into an elderly woman with gray hair and slower steps, but whose dignity emanated like its own light. At 76, her body bore the marks of a difficult journey, but her spirit remained surprisingly vibrant, fueled by a faith that defied all human logic. Her figure became familiar at community gatherings, where she watched, with a mixture of melancholy and joy, the younger generations dancing under the stars, enjoying freedoms she had only known late in life. It was during the traditional summer Jubilee, when bonfires lit up the night and the aroma of festive foods filled the air, that Mary's destiny began to change again. While clapping to the rhythm of the music, watching the impromptu square dance in the clearing, her eyes met those of a woman observing her with unusual attention. Dr. Lewis, a volunteer physician who occasionally visited rural communities, noticed something worrying in the elderly woman's face: an abnormal pallor and a weariness that seemed beyond what was natural for her age. "Are you feeling all right, ma'am?" Dr. Lewis asked, approaching gently. Mary, unaccustomed to being the object of genuine concern, merely nodded, trying to hide the difficulty breathing she had been experiencing for weeks. But her eyes, always revealing, betrayed the discomfort she tried to conceal. With careful insistence, Dr. Lewis convinced her to come to the local health clinic the next morning. The Oakwood Clinic, like so many others in the rural parts of the state, was a simple building with peeling paint and outdated equipment. There, amid endless lines and impatient glances, Mary waited her turn, wondering if she wasn't taking up space that could be used by someone younger, with more life ahead of them. This thought, born from decades of believing in her own lack of value, was interrupted when Dr. Lewis called her name. The clinical examination, conducted with an attentiveness Mary had never experienced, revealed what the doctor already suspected: FD, a serious heart condition, possibly the result of decades of strenuous work and deprivation. "You need specialized treatment," Dr. Lewis explained, her seriousness tempered with kindness. "In Atlanta." The words hung in the air like birds of ill omen. Atlanta, for Mary, was more than a distant city. It was an unknown universe, frightening in its vastness and indifference. "I can't go," was her immediate response, a reflection of a deep fear of the unknown and the certainty that she wouldn't have the means to survive far from her small, familiar world. How could she explain that? At 76, she had never left the boundaries of Oakwood. How could she admit that the thought of navigating the labyrinth of a big city alone terrified her more than death itself? News of Mary's diagnosis spread quickly through the Liberty Creek community. where bonds of solidarity were woven with the same strength as the traditional woven mats that adorned the simple homes. During the weekly gathering with drumming and song, a cultural practice that kept African traditions alive, her neighbors and friends discussed ways to help her. In a circle formed under the moonlight, to the sound of drums connecting present and past, the idea of a collection to fund the elderly woman's treatment was born. "Mary is our living memory," declared Mother Teresa, the oldest woman in the high settlement, whose wisdom was revered by all. "When she washes our clothes, she also cleanses our souls with her stories. We can't lose our storyteller." These words triggered a wave of solidarity that surprised Mary herself. People who barely had enough for themselves offered what they could: a few cents, a chicken, promises to tend her small garden during her absence. This collective gesture represented the first truly transformative event in Mary's life in many years. For the first time, she felt not only seen but valued by a community that recognized her as an integral part of its identity. The tears that streamed down her wrinkled face as she received the envelope with the collected contributions were not just of gratitude, but of a late and overwhelming understanding of her own worth. Accompanied by Joanna, a young teacher from the community who volunteered to guide her in the capital, Mary boarded the intercity bus with her heart torn between fear of the unknown and hope of returning in renewed health. The 3-hour journey felt like an eternity, each mile taking her further from her comfort zone, each bend in the road revealing landscapes she never imagined existed beyond the confines of her small existence. Atlanta, with its buildings that seemed to touch the sky and the incessant movement of hurried people, confirmed her initial fears. "How can they live like this without seeing each other's faces?" she asked Joanna, watching the anonymous crowd move like a turbulent river through the wide streets. The public hospital, the final destination of that intimidating journey, proved as daunting as the city that housed it: a labyrinth of endless corridors, incomprehensible forms, and waits that seemed to have no end. It was there, on the hard chairs of the waiting room, that Mary faced the prejudice ingrained in the medical system. The doctor assigned to her, a young man with bags under his eyes and impatience in his gestures, barely looked at her face as he quickly leafed through the referral brought from Oakwood. "Advanced age, chest pains, probably just anxiety," he muttered, more to himself than to the patients. "I'll prescribe a painkiller. Next." Joanna's indignation was immediate. With a courage fueled by the sense of justice that had motivated her to become an educator, the young woman confronted the professional. "My grandmother didn't come all this way to be dismissed without a proper examination," she stated, intentionally, using the fictional kinship to strengthen her argument. "She has the right to the same treatment as any other patient." This intervention, born from outrage at the blatant injustice, represented the first small turning point in Mary's story, granting her access to tests that would reveal the true nature of her condition. During the 3 days spent in Atlanta for the tests, Mary and Joanna stayed in a small guest house near the hospital. It was during this period, sharing an intimacy forced by circumstances, that the elderly woman began to open the floodgates of long-suppressed memories. At night, while Joanna braided her white hair with the delicacy of someone handling a fragile treasure, Mary shared fragments of her story: the abandonment in childhood, the years of servitude disguised as care, the desperate escape, and the slow rebuilding of a life of her own. "How did you endure all that without losing faith?" Joanna asked, impressed by the resilience of this woman who, despite everything, maintained an unbreakable dignity. Mary fell silent for a few moments, as if searching for the answer within her own memories. "When you have nothing, child, even a speck of hope weighs a lot," she finally replied, with a wisdom that transcended any formal education. This exchange of confidences created a bond that surpassed the differences in age and experience between the two women. For Joanna, Mary's stories offered a perspective on Black and female resistance that her academic books had never fully captured. For Mary, the opportunity to narrate her own story represented an act of reclaiming her personal narrative, so often silenced or distorted by others. It was during this time in the Ida capital that the second significant event in Mary's transformation occurred. On the last day of tests, while waiting in the hospital reception area, a social worker approached, intrigued by the presence of this elderly woman, whose eyes revealed a silenced history. Claudia, a professional dedicated to identifying vulnerable individuals who might be entitled to unaccessed benefits, struck up a casual conversation that soon turned into an informal consultation. "Are you receiving any government benefits, ma'am?" Claudia asked, after hearing fragments of Mary's life story. Faced with a negative response, the social worker explained that, given the circumstances of her working life, decades of officially unrecognized labor, Mary might be entitled to special retirement benefits never before claimed. "There's a specific program for people who worked informally their whole lives," she clarified, filling out a preliminary form, with information provided by the elderly woman. "It won't be easy to prove everything, but we can try." This possibility, presented almost by chance in that hospital corridor, opened a window to a future Mary had never considered possible, one where she could rely on a fixed income, however small, freeing her from exclusive dependence on her work as a laundress, which was becoming increasingly difficult due to the physical limitations imposed by age and illness. With a confirmed diagnosis, a heart condition requiring continuous medication and regular monitoring, and the hope of a social benefit that could transform her material reality, Mary and Joanna returned to Oakwood. The journey back contrasted sharply with the trip there. Where there had been apprehension, there was now cautious expectation. Where fear of the unknown had existed, seeds of never-considered possibilities were blooming. However, fate, in its inscrutable wisdom, still held many trials and blessings in store for Mary. Upon arriving in Oakwood, they were met with devastating news. A storm of unprecedented proportions had battered the region during their absence, causing significant damage to the Liberty Creek community. The small cabin of wood and clay where Mary lived had been partially destroyed by the waters that overflowed from the river, usually so gentle in its course. The loss of her space, however humble, represented the second small turning point in her story. Among the few belongings lost in the flood were faded photographs, the only tangible record of decades of existence, and a small box where she kept mementos that might seem insignificant to others, but constituted her personal treasure. An embroidered handkerchief found among her baby clothes when she was abandoned. Old newspaper clippings about the Liberty Creek community, rare seeds preserved for future planting, stripped not only of her home but also of the few material anchors connecting her to her past. Mary was temporarily housed in the local church, ironically the same place where her story had begun 76 years earlier. The new priest, a young man with progressive ideas, had turned the parish house into a temporary shelter for the families most affected by the flood. It was there, amidst collective prayers and shared meals, that Mary found a group of devout women who welcomed her with a warmth that initially disconcerted her. "Why do you care so much about me?" she asked Miss Connie one evening, the leader of the prayer group and one of those responsible for the shelter. The answer came with a hug that broke down invisible barriers built by decades of distrust. "Because your story is our story, Mary. Every mark on your hands tells a piece of the history they tried to erase from all of us." This unexpected connection, with women who recognized value in her existence, awakened in Mary a deeper understanding of community and belonging. Mornings at the parish house began with shared coffee and ended with stories exchanged under the flickering candlelight. Between these two moments unfolded a day of small gestures of mutual care that, added together, formed a fabric of acceptance Mary had never experienced so fully. Miss Connie, moved not only by Christian compassion but also by a strong sense of social justice and historical reparation, realized the transformative potential Mary's story could have for the wider community. After weeks of daily interaction with the elderly woman, whose nighttime narratives captivated everyone in the shelter, she invited her to share her journey during a community meeting that would bring together various segments of local society. "I have nothing important to say," was Mary's immediate response, a reflection of a lifetime spent being convinced of her insignificance. The invitation represented a monumental challenge for someone who had learned to survive in invisibility, for whom silence had often been the only protection against further violence. However, Miss Connie's gentle but firm insistence and the enthusiastic support of Joanna, who visited the shelter regularly, slowly eroded her resistance. "Your voice could be the beginning of healing for many wounds we don't even know we carry," Joanna argued, using her academic knowledge to contextualize the importance of testimonies from survivors of historical oppression. "It's not just for you, Mary, but for all who came before and all who will come after." The third transformative event in Mary's journey thus occurred on a full moon night, in the parish hall filled with people from diverse backgrounds, from farm workers to professionals, from restless children to attentive elders. Trembling like a leaf in the wind, Mary sat in the chair prepared for her in the center of the circle, her hands, usually so steady when scrubbing soap into clothes by the riverbank, now nervously clasped in her lap. The first few minutes were marked by hesitation and broken sentences, a testament to decades of being silenced. Gradually, however, as her eyes met attentive and genuinely interested faces, her voice gained firmness. The words began to flow like the river waters she knew so well, sometimes churning in emotional rapids, sometimes gliding smoothly over less painful memories. For nearly 2 hours, Mary unraveled the story of her experiences: the initial abandonment, the years of disguised servitude, the small rebellions that kept the flame of her humanity alive, the desperate flight, and the patient rebuilding of a life of her own. She spoke of the calloused hands that had washed clothes for generations of local families, of the lonely nights when her only companions were the stars, of the mornings when the sunrise represented not just a new day, but the renewal of hope to be truly seen. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the emotional catharsis of that unprecedented sharing, the entire hall remained in respectful silence, as if processing the weight and magnitude of the testimony received. Slowly, a woman stood up and, without uttering a word, approached to embrace Mary. Then another, and another. Soon, a spontaneous line formed of people wanting to express gratitude for the sharing that, in different ways, had touched everyone present. Among those impacted by Mary's account was Gabriel, a lawyer who dedicated part of his time to causes related to the rights of traditional communities. Educated in Atlanta but with family roots in Oakwood, he was in town visiting relatives when he heard about the event at the parish. What he heard that night not only moved him as a human being but activated his professional radar for possible rights violations that could be rectified even decades later. In the following days, a relationship of trust began to develop between Mary and Gabriel. In careful conversations, the lawyer gathered more detailed information about the elderly woman's past, especially about the Liberty Creek community that had welcomed her after her escape from the Harrison house. Through research in county archives and contacts with specialized organizations, Gabriel made a surprising discovery that would constitute the first medium turning point in Mary's story. There are documents proving that these lands where the community is established legally belong to your ancestors, Gabriel explained, showing old maps and property records he had unearthed. The occupation by local landowners was never officially regularized. There's a legal basis to claim collective ownership in the name of the Liberty Creek community. This revelation opened an entirely new horizon for Mary and the entire community that had embraced her. The possibility of land title regularization and official recognition as a historic settlement meant not only security of tenure, but also access to specific public policies and cultural validation. However, as expected, the news was not passively received by the local wealthy landowners who, for generations, had illegally occupied the lands, gradually expanding their properties at the expense of the original inhabitants. Veiled threats began to circulate through the community, creating a climate of tension that contrasted with the newly discovered hope. "They say they'll poison the river if we continue with the process," Mother Teresa confided to Mary, expressing the fear many felt facing the economic and political power of the landowners in the region. This external resistance only strengthened Gabriel's determination, who saw the cause not just as a legal case, but as an opportunity for historical reparation. Parallel to this battle for ancestral land, Mary faced another significant challenge: The process for obtaining retirement benefits, initiated with the social worker in Atlanta, hit seemingly insurmountable bureaucratic obstacles. "We need documentation proving your work all these years," explained the local Social Security Administration employee, facing a Mary bewildered by technical terms and institutional requirements. Formal employment records, contributions, any official record. How could she prove decades of work performed on the margins of formality? How could she translate a life of labor that existed in the shadows of the official economy into papers and stamps? This apparent impossibility represented the third small turning point in Mary's journey, forcing her and her supporters to seek alternative paths to secure a right that, although legitimate, seemed inaccessible within the system's conventional parameters. It was Joanna who, using her knowledge of institutional intricacies, suggested a creative solution. "We need witnesses," she proposed, after consulting a lawyer specializing in Social Security law. "People who can confirm that you worked as a laundress all these years. And we need to find any written record mentioning your work, old receipts, notes, anything." The search for this evidence turned into a true archaeology of Oakwood's collective memory. Mary's former clients were contacted, some now elderly like herself, others the children and grandchildren of those who had used her services decades ago. Family albums were scoured for photographs that might show Mary working. Household ledgers, where matriarchs recorded expenses and hired services, were unearthed from dusty chests. The fourth significant event in this journey occurred when the priest, intrigued by the frantic search for documentary evidence, remembered the old parish records stored in the church archive. "Maybe there's something there," he suggested, leading Joanna and Mary to the small room where centuries of local history were preserved in leather-bound books with pages yellowed by time. After hours of meticulous searching, they made a precious discovery, a baptismal record that not only confirmed Mary's approximate date of birth, but also included a marginal note written by a previous priest, mentioning the circumstances of her abandonment and subsequent placement with the Harrison family. This document, though not directly proving her work as a laundress, established an official timeline for her existence and corroborated part of her personal narrative. Strengthened by this small documentary victory, Mary allowed herself to participate more actively in community life, gradually overcoming decades of self-imposed isolation. During the traditional community harvest gathering, an event that mobilized the entire Liberty Creek settlement, she offered to prepare the lunch to be shared by the workers. It was in this context of celebrating collective work under the harsh, midday sun that the fifth significant event in her journey occurred. While stirring the large pot of black-eyed peas, Mary felt a sharp pain in her chest, different from the usual discomforts of her condition. The world around her seemed to blur, voices became distant, and her legs lost their firmness. Before she could call for help, darkness completely enveloped her. Her frail body collapsed silently, like a dry leaf finally detaching from the branch after withstanding countless storms. The cheerful buzz of the gathering immediately turned into concentrated concern. Gentle hands carried her into the shade, while someone ran to call the recently acquired county ambulance. The trip to the local hospital, though brief, felt eternal to those monitoring her weak, irregular breathing. "Don't leave us now, Mary," whispered Mother Teresa, holding her cold hand. "Your story is just beginning to be rewritten." At the small Oakwood hospital, a young nurse named Rachel was assigned to care for the unconscious elderly woman. While checking her vital signs and preparing emergency medication, something in Mary's face sparked a dormant memory. During her break, Rachel sought out Joanna, who waited anxiously in the waiting room. "This lady, is she the same one who delivered me 30 years ago?" she asked, with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. The question surprised Joanna, who was unaware of this aspect of Mary's life. Together, they sought confirmation from Mother Teresa. Yes, Mary was known as a midwife before her hands became too shaky for that delicate work, confirmed the community elder. She brought many children into the world when the hospital was just a distant dream for our people. This revelation constituted the second medium turning point in Mary's story, bringing to light a dimension of her existence that had remained obscured by time and circumstance. Her role as a guardian of traditional healing and midwifery knowledge, passed down orally through generations. What for her had been just a natural part of her community contribution actually represented an invaluable, intangible cultural treasure in the preservation of ancestral wisdom. Moved by gratitude and recognition of the importance of this cultural heritage, Rachel contacted a college friend working on a university project documenting traditional knowledge. Christina, an anthropologist dedicated to recording cultural practices at risk of extinction, visited Mary as soon as she was discharged from the hospital. The invitation to participate in the cultural preservation project, sharing her knowledge of medicinal herbs and traditional birthing techniques, represented the sixth important event in the gradual transformation of her life. "Your knowledge isn't just memories, Miss Mary," Christina explained during a long conversation on the makeshift porch of the shelter where the elderly woman still resided. "It's cultural heritage that can benefit future generations and strengthen your community's identity." The possibility that her knowledge, acquired through observation and direct experience with nature, could be academically valued and preserved for posterity, represented a form of recognition Mary had never imagined possible. While slowly recovering from the cardiac episode, nourished by a diet carefully planned by Rachel, and strengthened by the teas she herself had taught the younger ones to prepare, Mary regularly received updates on the Liberty Creek land claim process. Gabriel, tireless in his dedication to the cause, managed to schedule a first hearing at the district court, an event that generated both anticipation and apprehension in the community. The approaching hearing intensified tensions with the local landowners. What were once veiled threats turned into explicit intimidation. One night, they found the community gardens destroyed, plants uprooted, irrigation systems damaged. This direct assault on the community's livelihood represented the third medium turning point, creating a sense of urgency that hadn't existed before. "They want to scare us, make us give up," Gabriel observed, documenting the damage to include in the case file. "But every act like this only strengthens our argument about the need for legal protection for this community." During a traditional blessing ceremony, held to spiritually fortify the community before the court hearing, Mary, participating as an apprentice to the older prayer women, had an experience many interpreted as a divine sign. As purifying herbs were burned and ancestral chants filled the air, the elderly woman entered a semi-conscious state in which she glimpsed figures she identified as her ancestors, working the same land they were now fighting to reclaim. This vision, interpreted as a message of approval and encouragement from the ancestors, constituted the seventh significant event in her journey, strengthening her personal determination and inspiring the entire community. The day of the hearing dawned with a light rain that many interpreted as purifying tears from heaven. The district court, located in the neighboring town, became the destination for a small caravan of Liberty Creek residents, led by Mary, who insisted on being present despite her frail health. "This land runs in my veins like blood," she declared, as she was helped onto the bus rented for the occasion. "I need to be there so they know we're not just fighting for papers, but for our very existence." The local radio station, the only media outlet with significant reach in the region, obtained permission to broadcast the hearing, allowing those who couldn't travel to follow the proceedings. In many simple homes in Oakwood, entire families gathered around radios, some praying silently, others anxiously discussing each argument presented. The judge assigned to the case, a middle-aged man known for his conservatism, initially showed little sympathy for the cause. His body language, furrowed brows, impatient gaze, suggested skepticism about the legitimacy of the claims presented. Gabriel, however, had prepared a robust argument based not only on contemporary legal aspects, but also on historical documents tracing the traditional occupation of the area. The decisive moment, constituting the first major turning point in Mary's story, occurred when Gabriel presented records found in state archives, including documents from the slavery era, specifically mentioning the disputed area as a refuge for freedom seekers. A map dated 1872, clearly showing the original configuration of the lands before the gradual expansion of surrounding farms, caused a telling silence in the courtroom. These documents, the judge declared after carefully examining the evidence, establish beyond a shadow of a doubt the traditional occupation of this area by the Liberty Creek community, even before the formal abolition of slavery. His decision, favoring the preliminary recognition of the community's territorial rights, surprised both the landowners present and the Liberty Creek residents themselves, who had learned through generations of disappointment to expect little from the justice system. This legal victory, though only the beginning of what promised to be a long process, reverberated through the community like a ray of concrete hope. For the first time in their long history of resistance, they held an official document recognizing the legitimacy of their presence on that land. For Mary, who had lived nearly 8 decades witnessing injustices that seemed immutable, this decision represented confirmation that her persistent faith had not been in vain. The joy of victory, however, was soon tempered by the reality of resistance. The landowners, disgruntled with the court's decision, intensified their intimidation tactics. Using their economic power and local political influence, they managed to physically block access to the areas recognized as belonging to the Liberty Creek community, installing fences and hiring private security guards to prevent the rightful owners from entering. It was in this context of stalemate that the 8th significant event in Mary's journey occurred. Christina, the anthropologist, documenting the elderly woman's traditional knowledge, had connections with a social documentary producer. Impressed by the story of resistance of Mary and the Liberty Creek community, she proposed producing a special report for a national television program dedicated to social issues. "Your story deserves to be known beyond the borders of Oakwood," she argued, explaining the proposal to a hesitant Mary, still uncomfortable with the idea of public exposure. The report, filmed over an intense week, captured not only the current struggle for land but also Mary's personal journey, from her abandonment in childhood to her current role as guardian of collective memory and symbol of resistance. Broadcast during prime time, it reached millions of viewers across the country, sparking a wave of solidarity that transcended geographical and social boundaries. Letters, emails, and messages of support began pouring into the community. Human rights organizations offered complimentary legal assistance. University students organized peaceful protests in front of the state capitol, demanding immediate action to ensure compliance with the court decision. This national mobilization, triggered by the media visibility of Mary's story, constituted the second major turning point in her journey, transforming a local conflict into a cause with national repercussions. Public pressure resulted in the intervention of the Department of Justice, which ordered the immediate restoration of possession of the ancestral lands, with law enforcement support if necessary. The official demarcation ceremony, held on a sunny morning that seemed to bless the historic moment, brought together not only the Liberty Creek community, but also representatives of social movements, public officials, and journalists documenting the outcome of the struggle that had captured the nation's imagination. During this ceremony, while watching the placement of the official markers establishing the boundaries of the recovered land, Mary was approached by an elderly woman who had traveled from afar after watching the television report. "I knew your mother," the stranger declared, tears in her eyes, causing an indescribable commotion in Mary. This 9th revealing event opened up a possibility the elderly woman had never considered viable, discovering her family origins, filling the ancestral void she had always carried like an invisible wound. The following months brought profound transformation, not only to Mary's personal life but to the entire community structure. With support from nonprofit organizations and funds obtained through cultural projects, the Liberty Creek community began developing initiatives for economic sustainability and cultural preservation. Part of the recovered land was designated for the creation of a community center dedicated to preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge, a project Mary followed with special interest, offering guidance based on her vast experience. During the initial construction phase of this center, the 10th significant event in her journey occurred. Workers, preparing the ground for the foundations, discovered an old wooden chest buried underground, containing documents and objects directly related to the community's ancestors. Among the preserved items were diaries, handcrafted tools, and ancestral seeds carefully stored in small cloth bags. This impromptu archaeological find provided a tangible connection to the history that had long existed only as oral tradition. The objects, documented and later integrated into the community center's collection, became educational tools for new generations to concretely understand their roots and the importance of cultural preservation. For Mary, encountering these artifacts represented further confirmation of the legitimacy of her struggle and the historical continuity of her community. The inauguration of the community center, scheduled to coincide with the Summer Jubilee, the significant date that had initiated the entire transformation in Mary's life a year earlier, attracted visitors from various parts of the country. Among the special guests were researchers, social activists, and representatives from other traditional communities interested in learning about Oakwood's successful experience. No one, however, could have predicted that this event would be the stage for the third and most significant turning point in Mary's story. Among the crowd gathering for the inaugural ceremony, an elderly woman, accompanied by her daughter, anxiously searched for Mary. Clara, 78, had traveled over 1,000 miles after recognizing familiar features in the television report that had haunted her dreams for decades. "My sister," she whispered when she finally found Mary, taking her wrinkled hands in hers. "I've looked for you my whole life." The story Clara shared in the following days filled gaps Mary had never expected to see completed. Born to a single mother who worked as a domestic helper on a farm near Oakwood, the sisters had been separated when Clara was just 2 years old, and Mary was a newborn baby. The mother, gravely ill and without resources to raise both daughters, had made the painful decision to leave the younger one at the church, hoping she would find a better life while struggling to survive with the eldest. She died just a few years later, Clara explained, showing the only photograph she had of their mother, a young woman with sad eyes and a restrained smile, whose features Mary immediately recognized as similar to her own. "Her last wish was that I never stop looking for you. I spent decades following any clue, no matter how small." This family reunion, after 76 years of separation, represented the miracle Mary had secretly hoped for throughout her life. The confirmation that she was not alone in the world, that a blood tie connected her to a broader history than her own individual existence. The two sisters, marked by different yet equally challenging paths, recognized each other immediately, not only in their physical features, but in the resilience that had kept them alive and dignified despite adversity. Over the next year, the small house built for Mary on the recovered lands of the Liberty Creek community became an informal center for knowledge transmission. Young mothers sought her advice on medicinal herbs and newborn care. Farmers consulted her wisdom on nature's cycles and traditional farming techniques. Researchers recorded her stories, preserving for posterity narratives that might otherwise have been lost to time. Clara, who chose to stay in Oakwood to make up for lost time with her sister, brought not only family memories but also craft skills that complemented Mary's knowledge. Together they started traditional weaving workshops, teaching the community's young women nearly forgotten techniques that now found new cultural and economic value. Mary's transformation, from a lonely, resigned elderly woman to a respected guardian of collective memory, inspired other women in the community to claim their own space and value. Young people who had previously planned to leave Oakwood seeking opportunities in large cities discovered possibilities for personal and professional development within their own community, now strengthened by legal recognition and cultural appreciation. On a quiet afternoon, sitting in the shade of a century-old oak tree that had silently witnessed generations of struggles and resistance, Mary contemplated the movement of the revitalized community. Children ran freely on land that now officially belonged to their ancestors. Women gathered for collective work, their voices mingling in conversations and traditional songs. Men built new structures that would house community income-generating projects. Observing this scene, Mary felt a peace that transcended any material comfort. Her faith, so often tested by circumstances that seemed to confirm divine absence, now found justification in the unexpected developments of her own story. Justice, so slow in its manifestation that it had almost seemed non-existent, had finally revealed itself, not only through court decisions but primarily in the recognition of her intrinsic value as a human being and bearer of ancestral wisdom. Her 76 years of waiting had not been in vain. Every pain endured, every humiliation silently absorbed, every small act of seemingly insignificant resistance formed the threads of a complex tapestry that now revealed its complete design. Her personal story, intertwined with the collective journey of her community, had become a symbol of a resistance that transcended her own individual existence. The marks on her body, hands calloused by hard work, knees deformed by decades kneeling by the river, back bent by the weight of physical and emotional burdens, were no longer symbols of oppression, but medals of honor testifying to her unbreakable determination to remain dignified in a world that had systematically tried to convince her of her lack of worth. And so, contemplating the horizon where the hills met the sky in perfect harmony, Mary understood that her life, seemingly small and insignificant in the eyes of the world, had actually been a monument to the persistence of the human spirit in the face of the most devastating adversities. Her legacy was not measured in material possessions or conventional achievements, but in shared wisdom, preserved traditions, lives touched and transformed by her quiet example of unwavering dignity. For the true miracle, Mary realized with the clarity only advanced age can provide, lay not in the extraordinary events that had transformed her material situation, but in the preservation of her capacity to love and believe, despite everything that had tried to extinguish that flame. Redemption had not come like lightning from a clear sky, but like water that persistently shapes the hardest stone, drop by drop, day after day, year after year, until the impossible becomes tangible reality. And in this certainty, Mary found the peace that surpassed all understanding, the comprehension that even in the darkest nights, dawn always arrives for those who have the courage to keep believing in its possibility.